Hey everyone, welcome to the Fundamental Escape podcast. I'm your host, Mark Fitzgerald, and today we have a repeat visitor, a guest, Doug Pagitt. How are you doing today, Doug?
Glad to be a friend of the show.
An ambassador. Yeah, so just quickly, how's the book Flipped been going since we last spoke?
Well, thanks for asking about it. Like a lot of authors, I feel like it's sold better than it deserves and not as well as I want it to. So yeah, no, I'm really thrilled about it.
Yeah.
It's been a fun project and really great conversations with people. And yeah, thanks for asking. I'm awfully proud of the book and
Yeah,
glad to talk
yeah.
about it anytime I can.
Fantastic, fantastic. So we also have another voice on the table today, Lucas. So Lucas is my co-host, I guess you could say, of my Belief series, which is my YouTube endeavors. So how are you doing today, Lucas?
I'm very good, Mark. How are you?
Good, 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 good. Now,
Good.
obvious.
Thanks for having me. And Doug, I just want to say it's a honor and a pleasure to talk to you. I've learned a little bit about you today, thanks to YouTube. And as I told Mark in the beginning, when we first connected tonight, I thought that you were a great example of a fine human being. You really seem
Oh,
like a nice guy.
it's awfully kind of you. Thanks.
Yeah, no, wise words. I totally second that. So we're gonna. This is a little bit experimental. I'll just put that on the table for the listeners. I guess I'll be playing a sort of, as I say, a mediator type role in this discussion. I'm quite keen to hear these different sort of points of view. You know what I'm saying. So Doug, obviously you would fall into the category, I suppose, if we're going to get labely. You'd be a believer, I guess, a theist would be fair to say.
Yeah, I wouldn't self-identify that way, but if I was accused of being one, I don't think I could defend
I know
myself.
I find these
So,
labels just problematic too,
yeah,
but yeah,
yeah,
for the
no.
sake of
In
discussion.
the atheist theist category,
Yeah,
I
yeah. I
guess
suppose
I'd be in
yeah,
the
that's probably
category
a
of
better way to
theist.
frame it. If you were being labelled by an outsider, I suppose that's how they would tend to label you. Probably is a better way to say it, maybe.
Yeah.
So I guess I would be guilty of the same label. Obviously, that's not a secret. But Lucas, not to put words in your mouth, how would you? I guess how would you sort of identify you're comfortable with the term atheist as far as I know?
Yeah, I am, as long as it doesn't, invoke the mental image of the guy with the fedora. But I call myself, well, I'm basically an agnostic theist, right? So I don't really know if God is there, but I fairly well act like he doesn't, and that it's just us around.
Yeah, yeah. So Doug, as we mentioned before we jumped into the recording here, I guess maybe you could unpack a little bit more detail, but I did vaguely come across something you did a number of years ago called, it was Invite an Atheist to Church or something along those lines. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'd be glad to tell you about it. It was an effort in the United States that a fellow named Kyle Jones was initiating, and I jumped into it with him. And the idea was that Christian churches would invite an atheist to, ideally, to be a part of the sermon at a church service at Sunday at church. The notion being taking that primary slot that a lot of churches sort of highly prize, a Sunday full church time, church service kind of space, and in that the sermon, and to allow an atheist to either be in dialogue or to give a presentation that day as a way to have a conversation within that local congregation, but also around the country about the relationship between church engaged people and atheists. And I thought it was a great idea for a whole lot of reasons,
Oh yeah.
but primarily because I spent a lot of time at churches, my own, which is in Minneapolis, a place called Solomon's Porch, and then I spend a lot of time with church leaders and speak at other churches and so on. And I can tell you that the project we put together, having an atheist at church day, was not the first time there were atheists in these churches. Right? There's a lot of atheists at
Yeah,
churches, and not just the usher standing in the lobby. Right? Like there's a lot of them sitting in the pews. There's a lot of them standing in the pulpits.
yeah, yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I've
And
heard
and,
numbers on
and
that.
and this all kind of gets to something that I think what's why this conversation with you all is just as interesting. I want to talk about and talked about with Kyle, and we had him at our place recently. Another atheist from Minnesota, part of a large organized atheist effort in Minnesota, where I live in the United States, and and that is that people are not as responsible for their beliefs as we tend to act like we are.
Mm.
Like I happen to think that our beliefs tend to be more like something that visits us or befalls us or
Yeah,
happens in us or happens to
yeah.
us, much more than something that we choose and decide.
Mm.
Most of us are trying to catch up our thinking and our language with what seems to be happening in us. And so if you say to a community that somehow people who just can't talk about believing in God any longer the way they used to, that those people are not welcome in their communities and in their churches,
Mm.
boy, we're just really in trouble because you never know when that's going to strike someone.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's not as if it's I mean, I don't treat atheism as some sort of a, if it's self-proclaimed, as if it's some sort of a problem to be solved, nor that it's some sort of a derogatory term. It seems to me, a number of my friends and a lot of them who would self-identify as atheists, um, that they're doing the best they can to make sense out of the world, and that the
Yeah.
categories that they've been given by their religious systems or their churches, they don't work any longer.
Oh,
And what's a
absolutely.
person supposed to do is just act as
Right.
if it still works. So that was part of the idea, was to help it feel not as foreign as it often feels like it is. And it was shocking how even at very progressive places, how, man, I mean, you could be about anything on the theological spectrum. You could hold to a whole variety of theological topics. A lot of churches that are totally open to people of all kinds of lifestyles and social constructed lives, totally welcome there. But
Yeah.
boy, the idea that you're going to have an atheist give a presentation in the sermon slot freaked out people at a level that was really quite stunning to me.
Oh, absolutely. I can
There is a
imagine.
fear in the North American church, at least in the United States, of atheists that was really, I just found to be just really unbelievable.
Right. So just before I hand it across to you, Lucas, I just want to preface the conversation from my perspective in saying the reason I'm so glad to connect the two of you together in this discussion, I find myself in this weird space where I'm kind of like, and I know Doug, you tend to sort of bristle against labels and stuff as well, as do I, but I mean, I kind of, I don't want to get camped in with this sort of fundamental Christianity, or, as I've kind of coined the term fundamental atheism, which I do see more and more online,
Mm-hmm.
things like that. I'm still figuring this stuff out. And as I say, I'm glad you kind of reiterated those sentiments about belief that in our first discussion, Doug, you kind of talked about the whole idea of belief being something we live with as opposed to, choosing. So Lucas, do you want to throw in your thoughts on, what belief is and where belief comes from and your sort of opinion
Yeah,
on?
you bet. So I really very much agree with Doug, and I know that you and I have talked about this in one of our previous talks, Mark, but I think we both, well, at least I feel like we don't pick what we believe. Our beliefs sort of sneak up on us,
Hmm.
and very much like Doug said, we kind of just figure it out. Like I didn't set out one day to become an atheist. Ooh, what are these people? I want to see if I want to be one of them. It was a realization that hey, you know what? I don't believe this stuff. It doesn't
Hmm.
make sense to me anymore.
Yeah.
So, so yeah, I completely agree with the idea that we are, we're just people at the core, and we have our lives to lead, and perhaps a spiritual life is important. I don't know. It's not my thing, but if you, I think if you are thinking about those things like I am, like you guys are, then it's kind of interesting to find out, hey, what you really do believe? What's going on in your head? So I'm very curious to hear from Doug, though. Well, maybe we'll wait for that.
No, go crazy, go nuts, throw it out there.
Yeah. So I was curious. So I talked to Mark earlier in the day, just to sort of arranging this conversation. And Mark made the comment, don't put me in that box, Lucas, because I was calling him a quote Christian, and that does have a definition to me. That means something very specific. Little background on me. I think I've always been an atheist, sort of, but didn't really realize it. But my wife was evangelical Christian, so being Christian very much meant that she had a particular view on it. And your guys, both Doug's view, which I think I have a very clear understanding of now after watching a couple of videos, is amazing, and that feels warm, and there's a message there that I could really support and get behind. And I think that Mark kind of agrees with that much more than this fundamental Christianity. And I just wanted to say that is when I think of Christianity, I do want to put people in this fundamental box, because there's probably nobody more.
We fit well.
Yes, yeah. And so I think that, and so I was curious to hear from Doug, like, how do you grow up in America, same place I did, and come up with such a Jesus-like view of Christianity? Because that's not the way that people do here.
Yeah, no, I totally get what you're saying, and in fact, I have with some of my friends and some of the conversations I have with formal atheist groups here in Minnesota. My friend August Berkshire, who runs the Minnesota Atheists, often says to me, Doug, what you're saying, what you're articulating, that is not Christianity. Really funny that he will speak as if he gets to declare what its boundaries are, and he's like,
yeah.
I mean, he said, like, if everybody talked like that, he was one of our first people at have an atheist church day. He's like, look, if every church was like this, I wouldn't do half the work I'm trying to do of trying to tell people it's okay to be an atheist,
Yeah.
That's exactly what I was thinking.
So, and I'm not trying to pat myself on the back or anything like that, but I think what he's tapping into, and maybe what you're sort of recognizing, and his pushback, and I would really love to hear if this is yours as well, is don't fool yourselves, though, you people who think like this, into believing that somehow you represent enough of a force in the world to actually get any notice. Like, you are so obscure and so exceptional to most everybody else's experience that most people have a totally different view of Christianity. Now, I think he's too limited in that. I think that there's many people who express a more generous version of Christian faith than I do, and that is far more accessible than he. But that's a tension point, right? Like, how accessible is this kind of thing, and what is the dominant version of Christianity in North America? And I think a lot about this and spend a lot of my own personal time and work life energy in this topic about how visible are generous kinds of expressions of Christianity compared to the ones that it sounds like you're sort of articulating, Lucas, about like, hey, how do you even think like this? Because no one I know thinks like that. It's funny, like so many other little subsets of communities we find ourselves in. I'm around people all the time who are talking like this. I find it to be so accessible, and I'm not spending nearly as much time around deep fundamentalism, so much so that I begin to believe maybe that's dissipating a little bit,
Yeah.
Like, we all end up in our own worlds where we're in our own little echo chambers, hearing our own pieces of it. So.
Right. Yeah. Well, I completely agree with the idea of the echo chamber. And I think that's probably why somebody who like me, who starts off knowing so little about the doctrine, becomes essentially a fundamental Christian as an atheist. Because if you're not doing it this way,
Yeah.
that this particular way, then you're doing it wrong. And as your friend said, you don't have a corner on this market.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's true or not, because I don't spend a lot of time in faith communities. I do spend a lot of time talking to people of faith,
Yeah.
but we don't talk about, when I'm talking to them, we don't talk about doctrine really. So your kind of view. I mean, I got to tell you, it's so refreshing. It is so nice. And I mirror the sentiments of your friend who said that, if Christianity was represented mainly by people who say the things that you do, and it was, quote, like that all the time,
Is it
then,
is
Yeah.
isn't there a
then
Gandhi quote that basically says something along the lines of, I something, I love your Christ, but you Christ, or something along the lines to say
Yeah. Yeah.
you Christians are
Yeah.
so unlike your Christ, sort of a thing. And
Yes. Yeah.
I, it's interesting. I mean, just to throw it into the mix, I know I kind of threw out the term, fundamental atheist earlier, and I feel the need to sort of, explain the reasons why I used that deliberately. Over the last couple of days, I came across a number of sort of YouTube clips of people, very angry people, basically railing against the idea of religion and saying, it's this whole, like, I mean, I do agree with the sentiment, of atheism, saying we don't need, religion doesn't have the monopoly on morality, and I completely agree with that point. But when you see these kind of people with their veins essentially popping out going, we don't need religion to be kind, I'm going, what? Like, it's kind of jarring. And
yeah.
I'd also noticed as well, I think I'd said to you, Lucas, I don't know if we talked in
Sure.
detail, but there seems to be, I mean, I'm going to like use this sort of language. I was like, if atheism was a religion, which I know it's not. As I've said, I believe it mimics religion, as Peter Rollins kind of articulates. But there seems to be some heresy hunting going on in the atheist community. Like, I've noticed there's a popular YouTuber that's kind of on trial for plagiarism, and I actually saw a video of a group sort of railing against Lawrence Krauss and things like that. And I'm just going, what is going on? Because, and it reminds me again, I had the chance to meet up with Brian McLaren when he was here in New Zealand, and we talked about these sort of left right ideas and political sort of things and religious divides, and the way he kind of said it was, this is a human problem, right? This is
Yeah.
a problem of humanity. And Doug, maybe, I'm sure you'd have some kind of sentiment to sort of go deeper into that a little bit, maybe.
Yeah. I think Brian's really tapping into something, that there are particular approaches to the world that show up in different religions or in different worldviews. And the people who share a common approach to the world, so let's say people with kind of a curious, change-oriented mentality, there's people who do that in every religion and in every economic system and in every social structure. They have a really interesting time when they meet other people from other religions or social structures, talking with, and far less interest in being around people who have a dogmatic, fundamentalist view of the world.
Yeah.
And so dogmatism and fanaticism is not limited and is not the sole product of religion, right? I mean, it's just, in the 20th century, it is self-evident, right?
Yeah.
That around the world, and I know there's a lot, and I know that religion is often used a lot, and I am someone who finds myself sort of in the balance if I think religion as a force in the world has been a positive force, a neutral force, or a negative force. Like, there are days where I feel easily convinced in any one of those three places. I also am somebody who wants to argue that in a lot of ways, I think the faith that I hold, the kind of Christian Jesus-y faith that I want to articulate, doesn't make a very good religion. It's not
Isn't that a beautiful thing?
it's not made of the kind of fabric that makes it very positive religion. And there's reform movements inside of every tradition that wants to say that. I have friends who say that about Islam. I have friends who are into engaged Buddhism via Thich Nhat Hanh, and others who say that about Buddhism. I know I have friends who are Jewish who say that about Judaism. So we're all and there's something similar about, right, our view of the world, and then we engage our religious tradition or our understanding of a particular vantage point. So it's much more interesting to talk about the framing narratives that move people forward.
Yeah.
So they have fundamentalist oriented or dogmatic atheists. Of course there are, because there's fundamentalists and dogmatic people, and those people take on a whole variety of traditions. And what we should do is find ways to help one another with that, and not choose to blame the topic of our fundamentalism for our fundamentalism.
Yeah, I almost wonder, and I mean, either one of you feel free to disagree with me, obviously. I almost wonder if it's helpful in some respects. You could, in my mind at least, you could almost replace the word religion with tribalism, and I think we can look at that and go, we're all that, right? We're all tribalistic to some degree. We all have this tendency to group. I mean, you see it in the atheist community. You see these authors that get to prominent places, and people kind of, and it's, again, one of my pushbacks again is that atheism seems to be a word that's synonymous with intelligence, and not to be too derogatory, but it's clearly not the case. I think some of these labels kind of, can be an issue sometimes in these conversations.
I have a go ahead, Lucas.
Well, I was just going to say, for me, the word atheism really only speaks to the God belief. I guess I've been around it long enough to know that, you don't have to have a fedora. You're maybe not the smartest guy in the world. You could be the annoyingest guy in the room if you're an atheist. The labels, but labels are what people use to define themselves, and I don't really have a problem with being labeled an atheist as long as people will take the time to get to know me. And the issue is, from my perspective, in a lot of cases, as soon as it's known that I'm an atheist, well, I'm the guy standing in the corner then,
So Lucas, I'd be keen, I mean, just to sort of, just to keep the conversation rolling, obviously, I'm really excited to hear Doug's take on this whole street epistemology thing, as we mentioned briefly. It was phenomenal to me to come across this. It's. I mean, just to give you a little bit of background, Doug, it's something that's been, as far as I understand, was it a couple of years ago, was the guy Peter Boghossian. He wrote a book called A Manual for Creating Atheists. Very explicit title. And he has said, as I say, I quoted him in one of my blogs where he sat down with Sam Harris, and, Sam Harris said to him, "Why did you write this book?" And he said, I'm not quoting it perfectly, but he basically said something to the effect of, I wanted to give people tools to reason people out of faith, essentially. That was his, he's very explicit about that. So I don't want to talk on your sort of behalf or anything, Lucas. So do you want to maybe, if you can sort of give us a thumbnail sketch of this emergent sort of activity that's going on within the atheist community, and sort of highlight some key points about it?
Yeah, you bet. So as Mark said, Peter Boghossian wrote that book in 2013, A Manual for Creating Atheists. And it's a very, linguistically, it's a very challenging book for theists, because it uses some very sort of inflammatory language that they don't like. It says, it calls faith a virus. It basically says, one of the definitions that Peter Boghossian likes to use is faith is pretending to know things that you don't know. And of course, people are going to bristle to that kind of language. But where the rubber meets the road is, there's sort of this movement. Anthony Magnabosco, for one, is on YouTube. I recommend you take a look at his videos if you have any interest. But basically, what people are doing is they are standing on the street and they're asking people, "Excuse me, sir, do you have 5 minutes?" or "Ma'am, do you have 5 minutes to talk about a deeply held belief?" And they'll say, well, what kind of deeply held belief? Well, it could be, ghosts or gods or karma or whatever. And generally, most people are like, well, I believe, they'll talk about ghosts for a second, and then it turns into a God conversation. And essentially what street epistemology is about helping somebody discover if they have a good epistemology. Do they believe what they believe for a good reason? And so Mark has some very interesting adjectives for this process, and I'll let him.
Street preacher, by the way, I should preface that.
Yeah.
You're familiar with that tactic?
Oh, absolutely. Well, I mean, look, I mean, if I can, Lucas knows full well my opinions on this. I find it incredible. I mean, obviously, Doug, you haven't had the chance to see it, obviously, but to me, I mean, essentially, the way I sum it up is atheist evangelism. Essentially, I was so surprised. I was so taken back when I first came across it. I was so fascinated with the idea. I mean, just to give you an idea of the popularity of this, Doug, I mean, the guy Peter Boghossian, who wrote this book, was interviewed on the Joe Rogan podcast, which is, a huge channel, media sort of outlet.
Yeah.
So this is growing, this whole idea, and Richard Dawkins, I know he's put stuff on his website about it, and Sam Harris, and it seems to be this new tactic. I think, here's my thoughts on it, and then I'll throw it to you, Doug, because I'm sure you've got some thoughts. But to me, it seems like an overextension of the impulse to move away from this label of militant atheist, right? This kind of, we don't want to be labeled as, I interviewed a guy, Hemant Mehta, who's the friendly atheist, So there's this sort of desire to kind of go, we don't want to be labeled as angry, right? So it's this sort of passive, like, hey, what do you believe? Just let's talk about it. So, I mean, shoot, I guess give us your...
Well, yeah, I think I actually need to jump in and correct some things here. I mean, street epistemology, if it is being done, quote, by the book, is never a situation where the quote, the SE, we call them, the street epistemologist, is saying to the conversation partner, the interlocutor, that why you shouldn't believe what you believe because it's silly and you have no reason to believe that. It's simply asking the question. And what we're talking about right now, the three of us, is very specifically faith. This is, because this conversation is about faith and religion and so on. But epistemology is a very valuable topic, no matter what you believe. If it's a Bigfoot belief, why do you believe in Bigfoot? Well, because I saw this highly polished documentary on it. Oh, okay, but is that a really good reason, to believe in Bigfoot? So, yeah. And if we were talking about, say someone's particular theology, it would not be out of line in our in street epistemology to say, ask the question, well, why do you, what makes you think that hell is an actual place? And, what does one have to do to get there? And then by the person thinking about these very particular points and coming to their understanding, remember we talked about how we don't choose to believe stuff, we just start believing it. And then our brains kind of catch up with what it is that we believe. So epistemology, street epistemology, is really just about thinking about why you hold these beliefs. Do you have evidence to support what it is that you believe? And so we're not telling anybody that they're wrong. We're not telling anybody that they didn't actually see a ghost. We're asking the questions in a very friendly and polite way. Do you have a good reason to believe this? Because if you do, if whoever this person is that we might be talking to has the answers, if they have the truth about God, I certainly want to know that because I consider myself agnostic. I want to know, do you have a good reason? And if they don't, then they should figure that out themselves.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Here's a couple of thoughts. Initially, when you started to describe it, I my initial thought was, God, that sounds like a great idea. And here's why. Because I've wondered why the street corner engaging preacher types are always, in my mind, the angry super crazies. Like I've wondered how come people of my ilk aren't standing out on the street corner with a sign that's, saying, uh, you're never outside the love of God. There's more than enough love for anything you've ever done. There's no one's holding anything against you. You're a bundle of possibility and beautiful experience. Like, how come we're not out there saying that stuff publicly, right? And just letting strangers stand out and say mean, destructive, hateful things. And so it's really curious to me why there's not an effort to be, because every time some version of that shows up on YouTube or on videos, they go viral like crazy, right? Someone with a sign or something, and people come around.
Yeah.
It's really good. So my initial thought was, well, yeah, that's spectacular. Like people should be doing that. My thought about it, though, as it's being described, is this: that this seems like the kind of thing that philosophers and people who think about philosophy and philosophical constructs believe works in the creation of someone's belief. There's a certain type of person who understands their own belief construct in this almost foundationalist way. Mm-hmm. That what you do is you start with a good reason, and then on top of that you put some evidence, and then on top of that you put some analysis, and then on top of that you put some experience, then on top of that you put a decision, and you end up with beliefs being constructed like a pyramid, based on a foundation. So if you can start with someone's, deconstructing that and sort of reverse engineering that down to, see, you didn't really have a good reason for believing that, so why would you? And I can understand really good reasons for doing that, right? Like there's a whole lot of people who don't believe certain things in science that it would be really good if they did, and it's almost impossible to understand why people don't believe the planet's warming, or they don't believe that smoking is bad for your body, or they don't believe that sugar makes your insulin rise and is really bad for your, there's all these things that people don't actually believe, and then they see the destruction of religion, where people's seem to be setting aside their logic and setting aside what as otherwise reasonable people would think to hold on to this kind of fantasy world of fairy tales and so on, and they think, oh my gosh, people just need to be invited to pay a little more attention to what they believe. Okay, so I think that's the problem, right? Is that there's a belief that if you can show someone why their belief is silly, they won't hold it anymore. And it really works for a group of people who think that they believe things because they have really good reasons. And I don't think that's true. I think so often the beliefs that we feel comfortable with, that have come to visit us and we feel like we want to champion, as opposed to the beliefs that we have that we never tell anybody about, right? The ones that we feel confident about and want to talk to others about.
Yeah. Well,
we tend to think that we have good reasons for those, but we don't have any better reasons for those. There's a whole set of, in my view, of personal and psycho-emotional experiences and interpretations that cause us to give preference to some of our beliefs over others. And as someone who spends an awful lot of time trying to help people think new and change the story in their head and flip the script and all that kind of stuff, the thing that the least effective way to get people to change their beliefs is to try to show them that what they believe is silly. So all that to say, I just don't think it will work as a project. I don't think that's how people end up. So, Mark, I mean, it sounds like you want to break in there if you do, because I want to give a little example or a little illustration
go crazy.
How I came to learn this. I was in a debate that you can watch on the internet if you want to with conservative Christians about hell. And I was arguing the point that I think the Bible doesn't teach hell the way that Christians tend to in some traditions, and that hell's not a place and all this kind of stuff. And they were taking a view, sort of Dante's Inferno version of hell, right? Yeah. And I mean, at every I'm feeling like at every point I'm making the point I want to make. Like from the religious tradition these people hold, it doesn't fit. In any kind of practical rationale, it doesn't fit. Their own motivations, like I'm just deconstructing one after the other after the other. And at one point during the debate, it becomes obvious to me that none of these people want to believe in hell. They believe in hell because and it came up in one of the questions that happened in the Q&A time, because it seemed like the only option to deal with trauma and personal suffering. In other words, what is God going to do about the suffering that human beings inflict upon one another? So it wasn't about hell. And for this particular person who I talked to later, it was about making sense of their own sexual abuse. Right? So hell became a way for someone to talk about what happens to the pain that was caused to them when they were sexually abused over a long period of time. And strangely, the same thing has happened for a number of people in the Christian tradition who really argue against homosexuality. It often roots back to an other sexual trauma that they have. So to think that if I can show them that the logic doesn't hold is really what's rooting, or how their belief is functioning in their life, just misunderstands the human circumstance and situation. What we end up doing is borrowing these beliefs and have them function in our lives in particular ways. So it's far more interpersonal and than it is philosophical. So,
do you think that it helps, or that it's a starting point to be able to show that? Well, I think that you believe that hell is necessary and that it exists because it fulfills this need for you. But if we look at the actual words, we find out maybe it doesn't. Does it help to do that? Does it help get your point across, or
I've spent 25 years wishing that was true. I have written so many words, said so many things. No, it's shocking, and this would be true of any of us, right? You take any of what I would call a flip, any of the flips in your own life when you'd heard it said one thing and you believed it, but then someone else told you another story and you changed your belief, right? You lived into a new story rather than the old one you had in your head. Rarely is it when someone has shown you the shortcomings. In fact, if you're unwilling to let go of your belief for whatever function it has in your life, and someone starts deconstructing it, you create all kinds of protections around it.
That's totally true. And I mean, as part of this street epistemology, I mean, we say it's a 5-minute process, but and sometimes it is, but sometimes it's much longer than that. And I guess so. I really, a lot of what you're saying really does resonate with me. You never find a situation where a person goes, "Oh, really? Well, fine. I guess I just don't believe it anymore." They're like, "Thanks, have a nice day, shake your hand, and walk away." What they actually do is they, their beliefs really aren't moved deeply in the moment, but they do go think about it, and what we're finding is that they will reach out again, evidently at a higher success rate than internet marketing, where they reach out and they want to know more, or they ask more questions and that kind of stuff. So what you're saying does resonate with me, that yes, I do believe people will continue to hold on to their bad beliefs, even when you point out the flaws in the logic.
Yeah, I mean, every therapist will tell you, boy, just telling someone the flaw in their thinking isn't going to be enough to change them, or, you know.
Oh, yeah. And one other thing, this is near and dear to my heart. So, but again, it's not a matter of telling them. It's a matter of them helping them discover that, this fact for themselves. You never say, does that make any sense? Or, why would you believe a crazy thing like that?
But Lucas, I mean, just to push back a little bit, one of the most fundamental issues I have with this whole sort of thing is you as the person initiating these conversations are fundamentally putting yourself on another level to that person, and your beliefs are safe from the process.
When you're doing a quote street epistemology in the way that say Anthony does on the street in an interview, that's very true. And I don't think it's a bad thing the way that he's doing it, but what I'm suggesting is that the vast majority of people who are doing this are not doing it on the street. They're not doing it with a camera, and there is a conversation, and it's less exhibition and much more conversation. I mean, Anthony Magnabosco is doing this earnestly.
Absolutely, he totally is.
Yeah, I honestly believe that, and he doesn't approach people as if, and I don't even.
It's funny how you say you believe that.
Talk me out of it. No, I'm just kidding.
I'm trying.
I think that when he talks to people, he treats them with respect. I don't think he tries to put his atheism even out there. I don't think it's harmful actually if you let people know.
That's right.
If people let them in on it, on that. So in fact, when people ask him, he's like, well, we'll talk about me at the end of this 5 minutes. Okay. So he does give them, if they ask, he absolutely gives them equal airtime, and he will dedicate all the time that they want, that he has, to having a discussion about him and his beliefs. And I've heard, I've watched his periscopes every single time, and, people will preach to him for, 20, 30 minutes. I've seen it happen. And he's happy to sit there and have a discussion. Well, maybe not preached at, but he's happy to have a discussion with people. And I think that's what it comes down to for most of us. Anthony just happens to have the most videos. He's got the public face to it. But there is
what's funny? Sorry to interrupt. It's funny to me, as I say, I mean, obviously everyone is well aware, as I've put it out there, I was a street evangelist for 5 years, and I resonate with exactly what you're saying. I've seen, a handful of Anthony's videos. Admittedly, I do struggle to watch them because I find it hard to watch, but I see the passion and the drive that he has to do it, and the excitement that he has to do it, and I go, yeah, I know exactly what that feels like, because I was an evangelist too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in some ways, it's the same thing as what you're saying, Mark. Like it's that same temperament that is applied with a different topic. I have two sort of thoughts rolling around this. One is there's something both in the street evangelist on the Christian side or the street epistemologist is there are an awful lot of people who never are invited into a significant conversation about things of meaning. They go through their days and their weeks and the years of their life, and no one ever says to them, hey, do you want to talk about something kind of deep and interesting?
Yeah. People love it.
So I would imagine that if you're out on the street doing that stuff, you're going to run into enough people who are like, oh my gosh, totally. I mean, I haven't had an interesting conversation like this since that,
It's sort of making that extra step though, isn't it? It's saying, like, I totally agree with you, Doug. It's saying, because I mean, back in the day when I used to be on the street, I can't give you a number of people I converted. I don't know that I converted anyone necessarily, but I had some of the most engaging, compelling conversations. I mean, I had people in tears thanking me after the conversation. So
absolutely,
you know what I'm saying. So I think it's taking a leap of logic and saying, oh, great, this street epistemology thing is working because people are listening. Well, it sort of ties in with what you just said, Doug. It's like people, again, with the social media world where everyone's connected and everything seems so mundane and things like that. And for someone to come along and have something different to say, I mean, just to throw it out there, a guy I had on my podcast, Milo Yiannopoulos, I don't want to go too deep into, he's an internet phenomenon at the moment because he's a gay conservative Catholic. And he has, he basically, long story short, he doesn't fit the narrative of these progressive liberal ideologies that he's supposed to fit, essentially. And most of his following, or a huge number of people that enjoy what he does, are atheists, even though he's not. And it's quite interesting to me. And I think all it does is speak to what you just said, Doug, is going, here's somebody saying something interesting and compelling. I want to talk about it. And the other impulse too is that human desire where people are going, don't ignore me. And if someone comes along and says, hey, tell me what you believe. And I'm in sales. People love to talk about themselves, right?
Yeah.
So there's a whole bunch of things that are going on. I think it's more nuanced than going, hey, people are listening, therefore this is working.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think, Mark, what you were sort of pushing at by saying, look, if there's not an equal exchange or an equal sense of vulnerability, then you're really engaged in a power dynamic that one should pay attention to.
And it's interesting.
And I agree, and I would say that's true, but also I think you have to grant people enough agency where they could say, hey, I get it that I'm talking to a stranger here. Right? Like the answers people are giving to tell me something you believe and why you think you believe it is the answer that you would give to a stranger. And if there's a phone being recording or broadcasting or another film crew, then you're really already now in a performance environment.
Yeah.
Stranger to stranger in a social dynamic.
And you see that in the body language too. I've noticed.
Yes, I agree with that. And in a real life conversation, that almost, I mean, that doesn't happen. It's very much a different situation.
Now, I will say that I think, boy, any chance that religious people can have an experience where someone with a different worldview tries to convert them to their belief is a really good thing for most religious people. Most religious people have never had someone of another tradition, faith, or non-belief try to convert them in the way that many religious people just naturally try to do it to someone that they meet who's a non-believer in their views. So, man, it is a super good idea. Like I've talked to a number of pastors who have never had somebody try to teach them to believe differently than what they do, in some kind of a religious environment or somebody walking up to them. So, I mean, there's part of me that just thinks, boy, that's a really good thing if someone could have to be walking down the street and be met by someone who just says, hey, I'd like to think with you together about what you believe, and if you're interested in this kind of thing, maybe you'd want to jump. So,
Lucas, I'm keen to, if you don't mind sharing, like, I know you've been involved with this to some degree, haven't you?
With
like you've been doing it actively, haven't you? Yeah. So I'd be keen for you to maybe share some sort of background on the impulse that you personally have to go out and do it. Like, why do you see value in it yourself?
Well, So, So I was first exposed to it through YouTube. I love thinking about religion. I love learning about religion, all kinds. But I used to like to listen to debates, but then I just got to the point where I was done with it. Just the arguments are the same old, and no one has any any evidence to talk about it. But I still wanted. There was, long story short, YouTube said, here's a video you might like, Anthony Magnabosco, and I was like, okay, I'll check this out. And the first thing I was amazed. First of all, I think Anthony is, he's a very caring, reasonable kind of guy, and I was struck by, hey, wait a minute, here is an atheist having a conversation with a theist, and look, they are not talking about the dogma, they're not getting mired in apologetics, they're having a conversation about, really why we believe things. And that so resonated with me. I was dumbstruck. And then I proceeded to watch the rest of his videos, like in a binge
Like
watch.
Netflix.
Like, yeah, like why do these people, why do you believe? Oh, I can't wait to hear what this person's going to say. You know, how are they going to say this? And how is Anthony going to respond? And it was fascinating to me. And it still is because I like to talk to people and understand where they're coming from, that I think this ties in pretty well with something I wanted to ask Doug about. Doug, I saw a video of you and I think it was the Minneapolis Humanist Association.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Man, what a great conversation. So just to sort of put a frame on it, it was the humanists and you guys said very quickly in the interview, I think it might have been you. Okay, so we have our religious lives that we're living, and then after that, there's actual life to live. So how do we get
Yeah.
along? You know,
Yeah.
and that's what resonated with me. And watching Anthony's videos is like, hey, wait a minute, this is a way that we can engage people and we can have a conversation, and it's not a power play. Because you guys were talking about this, maybe the street epistemologist has a power position in this dynamic. Well, usually it's very much the other way around, where we've got the Christian street preacher telling us that we're going to hell, and making us feel bad for being liars who are going to burn, and all the stuff that Mark used to do.
That's what I used to tell people.
Yeah. Oh.
Yeah.
But now here's a different way to have this conversation. It was polite, and the people were free to go anytime, and we weren't baiting their answers, and we weren't trying to scare them with anything. And so at the end of the day, we all are here in this place at this time. And if we don't help each other and rely on each other and become, friends, dare I say, with each other, we're going to be in a big mess. And I think that's seen throughout the world. So, I would really like to ask the question, what do we do to get past who cares what our beliefs are? How are we going to start living together and start working?
And I'll tell you, I mean, that's really beautiful. And I like that notion a lot. We're at this church that I'm a part of called Solomon's Porch. A person named Victoria is putting together a project. She's our poet laureate at our place, and the project is to invite people to share with others how you came to believe something you believe. And there's something in that particular question, right? How did you come to it? What was the condition? What was the circumstance?
Yeah.
And it taps into this thing, which is there's a difference between what do you believe and why is this important to you? Because there's some things we believe that aren't important to us, and there's some things that are really important to us and we don't know what we believe. And sometimes the two sort of connect, right? Well, there's something about the way that I know and trust that Victoria is asking our community to reflect on this question. How did you come to believe what you believe? Which she is not laying her hands on that process in order to show someone that there's something else they should or shouldn't believe. Mm-hmm. She's just doing it in the human person-to-person and person-to-community engagement because everyone has a unique story to contribute. That seems a little different than when I go and do a sermon at some church, right? And I'm like, I'm going to say some things to all of you as a stranger because I really want you to take on what I'm thinking here, right? That I'm very leery about I go into that with great trepidation.
Yeah.
Or when some stranger is on the street and the real question for asking is not some sort of national public radio like project of saying we're interested in how people articulate the rationale for their beliefs, but really I want to expose to you if your belief is insufficient by the standards that I think a belief system must rise to. So it seems that there's something. Maybe I'm just overplaying what some descriptions of this, but that seems to me to be a different project, and it's one that I'm super leery of, sort of in how we as people honestly engage with each other and offer ourselves as a gift to one another, to be someone who weaves inside another person's web of belief. And I'm totally into helping one another think differently and believe differently. But I think it requires a real care and sensitivity to only do so when it's mutually understood. It's almost the way that, parents now want to make sure they talk to their kids about a sexual experience. Like, you really need explicit invitation and permission to proceed sexually, like, right? As compared to, like, hey, she didn't say no, right?
Yeah.
Like, no,
Getting into consent.
no, that's not consent. Like,
Yeah.
and so if the person asking the question, hey, can you talk a little bit about what you believe, really wants to get in and sort of screw around with the fact that you hold beliefs that I think are insufficient, and that's not part of the deal, I think that starts to push the boundaries that are being consent. So, like, if you're at a church and people have showed up at church, then it's sort of like, well, they kind of know what's going to happen, and then you get, and I'm still super, demure about the whole thing. Like, hey, I'm going to make some suggestions here, and I get that I'm in a power position. I'm working that sort of thing all the time, because I think we have to help people know how to give permission to one another a little bit better. So the impulse of, like, engaging in meaningful conversation with people about what they believe, I think, is so great. The idea that somehow you're sneaking up on that by, like, in the Christian evangelism world on streets, they used to do these things where you would tell people you were taking a survey.
I never did that, by the way.
Wow.
Right? But you weren't taking a survey. And when you said, I'm taking a survey, people believed that it was a survey. But it wasn't. It was a pivot point, so that if you answered in a certain way, now I would launch into a pitch.
It's a bait and switch.
It's a bait and switch. And no other survey did that to you, right? So if someone just says, hey, I'm kind of wondering what, tell me about something you believe deeply and how you came to believe that. If the person asking that question really has in the back of their mind, they're going to now put their hands on the conversation and control it and try to make something else happen other than sort of curiosity. I feel like that might be violating a little bit of our best practices, right? Like, I don't know, it's not a huge problem, but I don't know, it feels a little... But then on the other side, boy, there's an awful lot of people who aren't getting into any good conversations. And
well, I
do your best.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, and I think you should check it out for yourself if you're interested, because I don't know that I am a perfect representative of what it is or what it's supposed to be, and certainly Mark has a view.
Well, I do, and it's interesting. And just to say, I mean, I did try to engage with Anthony about what I felt about it on Twitter, and he, just didn't sort of seem interested in hearing an alternative view on it. And that's the thing. The way it's structured doesn't seem to favor being deconstructed itself. It's kind of setting up a premise. As Doug said, like this kind of idea that belief is a pyramid, that you kind of just stack one thing on top of another. And then, as I say, part of my pushback is going, well, I fundamentally don't agree with the premise of what you're saying to begin with. Like if someone, I love the response, when I get from atheists when they say, well, why do you believe in God? Do you have a good reason? I'm like, well, to be quite honest, I was indoctrinated. And then they say, well, how did you change your beliefs? I'm like, well, suffering, right? Like pain. And it's like, there's no, it sort of reminds me, and again, that whole sort of Me Too kind of thing that Rob Bell sort of says, like that solidarity. That's what I think is lacking in the whole encounter. If you watch it, again, it's this sort of lack of solidarity. And as I've said, it's not an aggressive militant, we're going to tell you you're wrong and you're an idiot, but it's kind of a passive sort of aggressive, and I have said that to you, Lucas, that's what my opinion is, that it comes across like, we're not going to just come across and explicitly tell you we're wrong, but we'll come across and say, well, tell me why you believe what you believe, and like let's talk about it. It's sort of a passive thing. I would rather someone be more upfront, personally.
Yeah, well, I
Hmm.
understand. I hear what you're saying, and I understand it, and I actually agreed very much with like Doug's idea that um, about this sort of belief pyramid that we're not likely to tear it down in a day. So I think that SE um, can be deconstructed, but I really almost feel like it's like maybe we haven't represented it right, or maybe that the view is not right because
Maybe it's
as
not as bulletproof as
Bogosian.
you guys think.
No, well, no, that very well may be. I mean, you could be absolutely right. Like maybe it doesn't work at all. I mean, one thing that we could say it does do is that it puts people of faith in direct contact with atheists, which are horrifying to most
Hmm.
Christians in the world,
Hmm.
in a polite and constructive kind of way. I mean, the way that Bogosian is trying to teach this street epistemology, it's not a I'm giving you a lesson. It is you are working together in this Socratic
Yeah.
method to figure out the answer. And again, you do have to be open to it. And if you're not, like, I don't know what it would take to get Anthony, for example, to become a Christian. I don't know what it'd take for me either. But
Let's get
it's
him to
not.
doubt street epistemology to begin with.
Well, maybe he could, but that well anyway. I shouldn't chase that rabbit anyway, or that squirrel. Yeah, but so street epistemology certainly can't be a perfect thing. Nothing is, and there's going to be flaws, but it has its benefits. There are some good things about it. And I think it should be like I feel like some of what you have talked about, Mark, is accurate. Like some of your
I think I like to believe I'm right.
some of your views, maybe are the right thing to think about street epistemology, but a lot of them are not. They're very heavily influenced by who you were. I think.
Well, that's the whole point, though, isn't it? That's the whole
Sure, of
point.
course.
You just kind of hit that on the head. Like, the reason I bristle against it the way I do is because I've been down the road that I have, right?
Yeah.
Which speaks to the whole point of where belief even comes from. As I say, as Doug sort of articulated in both our conversations now, you
Yeah.
don't just choose your belief like you're ticking a box. It does not work like that. And street
Mhm.
epistemology, from what I can see and what I have seen, treats belief like that's what it is, and it's fundamentally not.
Yeah, I completely accept and agree with that. I totally accept and agree with that. But I think maybe where we differ is that talking about it and pointing out that the logic of the belief doesn't hold, that's where I hope there's some room to move.
Yeah. Any other thoughts
But
there,
but I
Doug?
guess but I guess embedded in the whole project is that believing in God is illogical, right? So it's trying to make that point sideways, right? Like subtly, where
Yeah.
I think I don't believe that that's the case, right? Because I don't believe that belief in God is the kind of belief that is formed via logic theory, math logic theory. I think it's
Hmm.
the kind of belief that is like, I believe that I'm safe in the world. I believe my parents care for me. I believe that my neighbor has my best interest in mind. Right? It's the kind of operative beliefs that cause human beings to live in particular ways in the world.
Hmm.
None of those are the kinds of beliefs that can fit logic sequence, right? They're
Yeah.
not.
Hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, one could even say, hey, your neighbor did a really bad thing when you were a kid. Why would you now believe that you're right? Like, it's not like that. So
Yeah.
I would push back a little bit sort of on the premise that belief in God is some kind of a epistemological endeavor, which is why I started my thought about this. And this is all new to me just in this podcast, so I should know that, right? But that this is the kind of way that philosophers and people of philosophical categories think that belief functions in someone's life. But there's different kinds of belief. It's sort of like how people in the biology are finding out there's different kinds of fat in and on our bodies. It just it functions differently. So there are beliefs that are just really formed out of like. So I'm thinking that this last weekend I was talking to somebody about recycling, and they were talking about recycling the cans or the cups that we use for communion at our church, and it was this great conversation. And I said, and she said, because sometimes people put the cups in the garbage can, so we should put a sign on there that shows people because they don't know that there's recycling. And I said, people know. And then we got in this thing where I said, well, when it goes to the garbage transit station, they also do a sort there. Like the garbage company doesn't use your choice of what can you put your cup into as the final stopping point. Yeah. And this person was just like, really? And I said, yeah, this is, they do it this way. She was literally thrown. She's just like, oh my gosh, my whole life I've been told that if I put it in the wrong can, it's going to end up in a garbage dump. And she just didn't know the facts about what happens with the garbage. Okay, that's a really different kind of belief in like what happens to your cup, because that's something that's just a verifiable fact, and I should show her that and what I know about it. And then she told me things she knows. But like I gave her information that was super helpful, and it dispelled a myth. But that's different than the kind of belief that she holds about herself, what contribution she has in the world, who she is, why she matters. Those aren't the same kinds of myths. And so belief in God, I think, is of it's a different construct in a person's brain, in a person's mind and heart than something like that. Or, if you say to somebody, boy, if you don't empty the trash on your computer, that's why it's slowing up. Like, no, it's not it. Don't worry about that. Like, there are enough beliefs that we all believe that are just myths that people have told us that just simply aren't true, and they're shown to be definable. Well, I just think God's a different category. It's a different place. So anyway.
Well, just to sort of further highlight what you've said, hopefully, the guy I mentioned earlier, Milo Yiannopoulos, who I interviewed, he, as I say, inevitably he's starting to connect with atheists, because even though he does believe in God, they are resonating with his political views and things. But he was on a podcast just the other day, and inevitably the subject of God came up, and there was a couple of guys. One said he was agnostic, the other said he was atheist, and they sort of got into this sort of back and forth exchange. And Milo basically said to him, "You're using the wrong tools." He said, "It's like trying to listen to a painting." And I just think, I completely resonated with that. And it just seems, because I always sort of wonder, I try and put myself in the atheist shoes, right? I'm kind of going, they're going, there's no evidence for God. And I'm like, what? Sorry, what would evidence actually even look like if such a thing existed in the capacity you're trying to claim that it does or doesn't? It's interesting to me. It's like, what's someone going to come along and say, here's a jar of God? Like, what's the deal, right? Like, what's going to be sufficient?
Right, like a jar of beauty or something.
Yeah.
I want to test the viability of beauty, or is beauty just a social construct? I know it's all part of, and I think it really matters. We should do this in another podcast, but it's all part of where does authority lie, and the hard sciences have been winning the day over the theoretical sciences and over the social sciences in the last 50 to 100 years. But the way of discovery that is very beneficial in the hard sciences and the logic sciences doesn't tell us everything about our world. Like, it doesn't tell us about theoretical physics, and it doesn't tell us about social sciences. You can't just move one determination of authority from category to category. And so some of the push is to say, look, the rules of hard sciences are not better than the rules of the other sciences or the other ways of knowing. This is my view anyway. And what we need to do is say that they all have the capacity to give us understanding of varieties of truths in the world, as opposed to you use the same tool for every kind of human experience.
Yeah.
That's just part of our, it's part of us figuring out as humanity who we're going to give credibility to. It's a pretty good thing that we've moved the people with religious power out of the slot of having disproportionate amounts of power.
Yeah.
I would,
Yeah.
and if that had to be replaced by a guy in a lab coat, or as you said, a guy
Yeah.
a fuzzy hat, fair enough. Like
Yeah.
I've been a fan of the new atheist movement for a long time, about the public atheists pushing back on the public theists. I think it's been a very good balance for our society
Yeah.
to say, yeah, maybe the best-selling books shouldn't always be cookbooks and Christian books. Like maybe there should be some pushback to that, because it's just not good for us to have these authorities be so unchallenged by the masses.
Yeah.
But on the other hand,
So
I think we have to be a little bit more sophisticated sometimes than we might naturally be.
I guess in respect of everyone's time, we probably should start winding down. I do.
We long ago blew through people's time. I think if they're still
Yeah, no,
listening,
no. I wasn't suggesting
we're
we're.
10 minutes
Hopefully,
in.
this is an engaging conversation. But Lucas, I just want to maybe give you the closing thoughts, if that's okay, just to sort of I mean, what are your overall thoughts of this conversation and the challenge and the pushback of this whole street epistemology phenomena?
Well, I thought it was amazing, and to sort of be like, for me, I think Doug and you are really putting a kink in my worldview. Like, it was much easier to believe that when that all these religious people that I knew, all these Christians, were these fundamental ones who, subscribe to all the things that I don't like about, fundamentalist Christianity. But I think Doug points, and I think I have like another hour of talking I could do
Yeah.
on just so. I mean, it was a great talk, and I really appreciate
Yeah.
your time and Doug's time. It was great to meet you,
Yeah.
and
Well,
I
perhaps,
hope.
Doug, I mean, I'm assuming you enjoyed this conversation. Are you open